The public education system has one-size-fits-all standards and testing methods that don't keep up with new research into the science of education, often use inaccurate textbooks, are hugely expensive while having poor outcomes even by their own standards, and can be unresponsive to the desires of parents and community members. Yet, the government continues to require parents to fund these schools, even if they want to send their children to alternative schools. They are forced by law to continue funding the government-run schools. It is imperative that we seriously look at other options, like voucher systems, and even the radical notion of getting the government out of education altogether. Now, Sir Ken Robinson, in his popular TED Talk, pointed out a fundamental problem with how we approach education.
What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it.
Public school, and many private schools as well, do not approach education in a very well-rounded way. And public school is really expensive for what it does do. For example, the largest initiative to combat poverty with the government largesse has been directed at Camden's public schools. New Jersey spends about 60% more on education per pupil than the national average, according to the 2012 Census Bureau, or about $19,000 in 2013. In Camden, per pupil spending was more than $25,000 in 2013, making it one of the highest spending districts in the nation. But all that extra money hasn't changed the fact that Camden's public schools are among the worst in the nation, notorious for their abysmal test scores, the frequent occurrence of in-school violence, dilapidated buildings, and an on-time graduation rate of just 61%. A lot of the difficulty in public schools is the fact that having one curriculum for a whole state or country results in a battlefield where policies like the Pledge of Allegiance, whether prayer in school is mandatory or banned, or creation versus evolution, require that there be winners and losers rather than letting parents choose schools based on their values. Even when history textbooks are shown to have biased, inaccurate, verging on racist material, as James Lowen revealed in his book Lies My Teacher Told Me, that takes a back seat to hot-button issues that could be resolved by abolishing the monopoly of funding for public schools. And finally, the moral problem. How private or homeschool parents must pay taxes to fund public schools, even when some parents cannot afford to fund the public school and pay private tuition at the same time. It's immoral to mandate this. So, what are our other options? Well, Milton Friedman was an advocate of the voucher system as a way to give parents more power to select against poor-performing schools in favor of better-performing schools in order to improve the overall education standards.
Now, how can you give parents more power? Here's a very simple scheme for doing so. It's a scheme that is very old, that I personally happen to have been trying to recommend and propose now for over 20 years. It's called the voucher plan. And this plan is a very simple one. It says you're a parent, you're sending your children to school, the government is providing public schools for your children to go to. If you decide if you would like to send your child to another school, a private school, you're saving the city money. The city doesn't have to spend, the city of New York today doesn't have to spend $2,728 per pupil to school those children who are going to non-public schools. Well, therefore, the city should say, very well, if you relieve us of the expense of schooling your child, we will give you a voucher, a piece of paper, worth a certain sum of money, which you may use for one purpose and one purpose only, to pay the cost of schooling your child in any school you want to go to.
Now, how about some examples of this? Well, in Belgium, 60% of schools are privately run, yet the money is attached to the kids, not the schools. Government funds education at many different kinds of schools, but if a school can't attract students, it goes out of business. If the teachers don't do well, the parents will put their kids in a different school. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of the first voucher systems in the US was introduced. It puts a cap on income a household can make and still receive vouchers that allows 58% of families to use them if they want. The vouchers are only worth a little over half what the public schools get per student. Yet, the students get to go to schools more suited to their learning styles with positive results not only for the students, but the whole local school system. There have been 6 empirical studies of the effects of the voucher programs on the public schools themselves, and all found that vouchers improve the public schools as well. In fact, no empirical study has ever found that vouchers had a negative impact in public school student outcome. But hold it. Let's re-examine this moral problem again. If it's wrong to force parents to fund schools they don't use, isn't it equally wrong to force a citizen that chooses not to have children to fund them? That seems like reason enough to look at the possibility of the supposedly radical notion of abolishing tax-funded education. Well, let's look at how education was before it was compulsory or publicly funded. Edwin G. West was an economist and economic historian at Carleton University. He was interested in the relationship between the state and education. He found that education was much more pervasive than is commonly thought. In fact, in Britain, a higher proportion of national income was spent on education before school was mandatory or publicly funded. And he found that the price for school was substantially more once compulsory schooling came about. Not only that, literacy rates have not improved since school became mandatory or publicly funded. In 1880, when national compulsion was enacted, over 95% of 15-year-olds were literate. This should be compared to the fact that over a century later, 40% of 20-year-olds in the United Kingdom admit to having difficulties with writing and spelling. He found that in America, in the North, literacy rates were over 90%, with the South lagging behind at around 80%. This is still better than today's literacy rates. Now, some often ask, what about the poor? Isn't that why we have public funding for schools? Today, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of extremely low-cost private schools that outperform their public school neighbors. As James Tooley has discovered,
on a day off, I went into the old city of Hyderabad. I went to the Charminar here, taking a picture taken at night, where I'd read in my rough guide to India, the slums of the old city were based. And I went with a hunch about what I might find, but was delighted when I did find down a street corner, into an alleyway, I found a low-cost private school. A private school in those days charging around $1 a month. I went to this one school, then I found another and another, and I soon connected to about 500 schools which were part of a federation. And I spoke to parents. Why were they sending their children to these private schools when they were poor? Clearly they were poor. And yet the government schools, the public schools as you call them here, the government schools were free. They provided free lunch free lunch and free books and everything. And parents told me their children were abandoned in the public schools. I got funding, managed to get grant funding from the John Templeton Foundation, and went on a journey looking in places like Kibera here, which is not far away from the shopping mall in Nairobi, Kenya, where such terrible things were happening last week. The accepted wisdom says a boy like this, Frank, where does he go to school? The accepted wisdom say he must go to public school or he's out of school. We followed Frank into the slum, going along the Uganda Railway there, into Kibera, and in fact he goes to a low-cost private school, one of about 100 in the slum of Kibera, in the most remote villages in these foothills of the Himalayas. Private schools, low-cost private schools, serving these poor communities. In fact, we found 586 of these low-cost private schools in these remote mountains. Again, where does Victoria, where does she go to school? She's the daughter of a fisherman. She's the daughter of a fisherman and a fishmonger couple. Where does she go to school? You probably guessed by now. She's in school, yes, but not a public school, in a low-cost private school, the Supreme Academy in Borciano, run by this man, Theophilus. We did a film, some of you might have seen it, called The Ultimate Resource, where we went on the fishing boat with the father, and wonderful, going out at 3 a.m, coming back with fish that they'd caught. Joshua, his name. We asked him, why does he send his child to a private school? And he told us, well, he tried the government school. It's right next to his house. He tried it. He'd seen the teachers wander in at 11, leave at midday. And he said the reason why the private schools are better than the government schools is because there is a private owner. If you don't teach as expected, you'll be fired and replaced. It was just like a fishing boat as far as he was concerned. People, if they didn't turn up for work, they didn't deserve to work. Totally unlike in the government schools.
I personally am familiar with the low-cost private school. In my hometown of Viroqua, Wisconsin, a town of only 4,000 people, there are 3 private schools, 2 charter schools, in addition to the regular public school. I went to public school as well as a sliding scale private school where creativity, academic performance, and practical skills were prioritized. The school has been internationally recognized for its performance and its novel structure. The students, parents, and faculty cooperatively govern the school, including students being on the board of directors, giving the students ownership of their education. Beyond low-cost private schools, there is homeschooling, or even unschooling. Unschooling is a concept that's gaining popularity in both Canada and the United States thanks to the frustration with the current public education system. In unschooling, the child is in control of his or her learning. They are free to decide what they want to study, and when they want to study it. This requires an actively engaged parent or mentor, but allows young people to gain expertise in their interests ahead of their peers who are stuck in school, dragging their feet as they are being taught information that they might never use again outside school. A new resource that makes unschooling and homeschooling even more practical than ever is the open source and online learning movements. Now, over the internet, there is a world of knowledge being organized into courses that, once completed, are practically free for as long as the internet is around. These online courses are even threatening the higher education institutions. Now, they will likely at least provide downward pressure on the price of schooling across the spectrum. So, when is enough enough? There isn't sufficient reason for forcing people to pay for the public schools. It seems that there is plenty of evidence that education can be and has been provided as well and cheaper by letting people choose their own educational styles themselves and being responsible for making it happen. Let's encourage diversity and get the government out of the education business and put that money back in the hands of the taxpayers. School doesn't have to be even in the equation. Intrigued? Offended? Visit the Whatcom Students for a Stateless Society for more disruptive ideas pursuing a freer future. It's on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. in Syrie 212. Have an awesome day, everybody.